morning, everybody. It's always good to hear everybody, all the conversation going on out there, and I'm sorry to have to bring that to an end, but we're continuing on. It's hard to believe we're already up to lesson 7. So today we've been talking about getting to Luther. We're finally going to get to him today, and next week will be our last lesson during the Reformation movement. We'll look at the other big guy, Calvin, that a lot of the religious groups of today are using a lot of that. There's another man named Zwingli that will, if I'm pronouncing that right, that we'll take a quick look at. And then we'll have the last 5 lessons. We'll jump into the Restoration. So if you remember, the Reformation is basically reforming of the Catholic Church. Things they didn't like about it, so they would come in and make those changes, and then a lot of times religious groups would start from those. But the Restoration is, of course, what we are and what we're still in right now. And we'll have about 5 lessons as we get to that. If you remember from last week, we spent a lot of time looking at the model of salvation for the Catholic, mainly the Catholic Church. And we talked about if you remember, indulgences, they were a big way that the church started finding a way to fund stuff, especially when they started allowing people to buy indulgences for their dead relatives. That turned into be a kind of a gold mine for the church as far as being able to raise money. We looked at this guy named Tetzel, who was really the most well-known, even though there were a lot of other people doing that at the time. So today, just a couple of slides before we finally jump into looking at Luther today. But the English Reformation, this is really an interesting story. Like I say, we'll just spend a couple of slides on that. And this really all dealt around King Henry VIII. Up there you see his dates. So he was really infamous for some of his wives. He ended up having 6 wives. And in starting off, he married this Catherine of Aragon. She was the wife of his brother who died. So after his brother died, he married her. But the problem was he couldn't get any male heirs. She had a daughter named Mary, who we'll look at in a minute. She also goes by another name that you may be more familiar with her. But the problem was, as we say, she ended up having, I believe, 6 kids, and all the males, 2 or 3 of them, either died at childbirth or died real close to childbirth. So King Henry didn't want particularly Mary to take over. He wanted a male heir to take over the throne. So he reached a point finally where he convinced himself that the marriage to his brother's wife was really against God's commands. He said it was a blight in the eyes of God. And I think it was more of an excuse. He really wanted to get this marriage annulled so he could move on to another wife. He had met another lady. And he was also really well known, or not well known as in a good thing, but he had a lot of affairs outside of marriage. He had several kids, including some sons from those, but all of them would be considered illegitimate when it came to the crown. So he gets in his mind that he wants the Pope to give him an annulment for this marriage. So he went to the Pope on a couple different occasions. And there was a lot involved. There was a lot of people involved when I started looking at it. But really it kind of came down to the Pope was afraid to make a ruling. He was afraid, well, if I give an exception here for his marriage, because I really can't find a reason for this annulment, then it's going to set a standard, and then everybody else is going to jump on board. And if I come out against it, then obviously he and a lot of other people are going to be mad. So basically what the Pope seemed to have done is just kept putting it off. He would say, I'll make a ruling, then he wouldn't do it. So King Henry VIII finally got tired of that and got mad and basically broke away from the church and would become the Church of England. He kind of got the wheels rolling for the church, but his answer really was, if you're not going to do what I want, I'm just going to break away and start my own church.
The irony is, he ended up with a girl there, anything.
He did.
Isn't that the way sin usually works?
So his point was, if you didn't hear John, is that he did end up with, a girl taking over the throne as his heir. So I mentioned is Pope Clement VII that he had been in contact with on this. And because of that decision, he ended up breaking all ties with the Pope. So what he finally did was he got tired of Catherine. He couldn't get an annulment, so he really just banished her, and he married this lady named Anne Boleyn in 1532. She had a daughter, Elizabeth, which we'll hear about in a minute too. She's going to play a big role. In 1536, he had her executed, had her beheaded, I believe. He really had no reason for it. He made up a couple of reasons, but history tells us that it was more, he was just tired of her and wanted to get another wife, or he was already having an affair with another lady. He then married his third wife, which we have an actress by the same name, Jane Seymour. She finally, again, it really was odd how many male sons were born to him that all died within the early childhood. So again, she had a son. His name was Edward VI. He again died shortly after childbirth. He married the next one, Anne of Cleves, who he soon had that marriage annulled because he got tired of her. So he was something, yeah. And then finally, he married Catherine of Howard. Well, that was his fifth wife. So Catherine of Howard in 1542. And the story goes, she was really young, so he was in his 40s by this time. It's estimated she may have been in her late teens when he married her. And he accused her. He heard that she was having an affair, and digging around what I could, it appears that there's decent evidence that she claims she wasn't, but there seems to be evidence that she was having an affair. So I think around the age of 17 or 18, somewhere like that, he had her beheaded, along with anybody that he felt like knew about it that was going on. So there was a group of several other people that were around her that also got beheaded because of that knowledge. And finally, in 1543, he married his sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr. Now, I mentioned his first daughter, Mary, so she also goes by the name of Bloody Mary. And if you remember, so he had broke away from the Catholic Church. King Henry VIII had broke away from the Catholic Church. But his daughter Mary was really a devout Catholic, so she hadn't followed in her father's footsteps. She had a short reign. She only reigned about 5 years. But she was very devout. It mentions here she had 300 people burned at the stake for heresy. Which in a sense, I had mentioned her father had about 80, same thing in his early days, because at first he was really a devout Catholic and actually been recognized by the Pope and given some honors and such earlier, until he had this problem with the fact that he couldn't get the annulment, and that broke away. But so she kind of followed in her footsteps in a sense, with these having a lot of people burned for heresy. And finally, his Queen Elizabeth, we mentioned, took over. She was one of the longest reigning queens in history, considered maybe one of the greatest queens that's reigned. And she finally officially got the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, up and running. It was now an official church for the state. We still see the Anglican Church today is still in existence. But really what separates this, and kind of why I wanted to bring it out, is this church was really started not because of a difference in beliefs as the rest of the churches typically would be. They wouldn't believe something, so they would decide we're going to break off and start a church, and it would basically be the Catholic Church, but with a few little twists here and there. But his really was just strictly started through the fact of greed and selfishness. He couldn't get what he wanted. And I think that's a good lesson for us today. I think probably every one of us could think about someone maybe in our life or someone we've known that either something in the church, they couldn't get something done, or they wanted something to be done in the church and it wasn't. Or maybe it was just someone that, someone said or did something that they didn't really like, something that got them a little bit upset. And the next thing you know, they've left the church, or they've gone to another church. And I want to tell you real quick, I want to kind of give you a personal story that kind of made an impact on me when I was younger. So I grew up, my father's parents lived in Fort Worth. We lived more or less in Dallas, so they were pretty close by. And my grandmother was probably one of the when I talk about someone that really impacted from a female and just her godliness, standpoint, could really quote a lot of Bible. I remember a lot of times just seeing her when she'd finally get work done, she'd be sitting over just reading in her Bible by herself. And so, really someone that made an impact. But I noticed that my grandfather never did go to church. I have no remembrance of him ever going to church. And on Sunday, they just lived in a small little frame house, just had a couple of bedrooms. But it seemed like every time I was over there was a lot of other grandkids. There was a lot of people that would just kind of come stay at her house or if they were having problems. But one thing that she always made sure of is if you were there on Sunday, she was going to pile you in the car and take you to church. But I never did know why. I'd ask a couple times when I was young, why is my grandfather not going? And she really wouldn't ever give me much of an answer. And it was later on, I believe late in my teens sometime, that we were sitting together and she finally explained that a simple thing. So he had come into the church, and when they first got married, he was going to church with her every week, but he would never do anything. He was really scared to talk in public. But they finally convinced him to start waiting on the table. So he got to where every week he would do that. And she mentions that finally he got up the courage. Somebody asked him to say a prayer on the communion, and so he finally got his courage up and he said that prayer. And she said that shortly after that, somebody pulled him aside and kind of, I don't know if berating's the right word, but basically kind of corrected some of the things that he said. Told him that maybe he needed to say this. He was new to the church. Maybe he didn't word things right. But she said that he came home after that and told her, I think it embarrassed him. It got him mad that he was never going back to church again. And she said he never stepped foot in a church again. And obviously, I'm not saying that that's because he made that decision. That's not a card to, he's still going to have to face his actions, obviously. But I think sometimes we get, or we think we're right, or we say something to people, and maybe we don't think it through sometimes. And I've often thought, just like the King Henry VIII here, if he would have gone and maybe sat down with this person and talked about it, there's things in the Bible that tell us kind of how to deal with issues one-on-one. Maybe things would have been different. So I think it's important, just kind of one of these little side notes, it's really important, to be careful with how we talk to people, careful with what we do, especially with new Christians. But that, the importance of working through our issues, not just when you get mad, leaving, trying to make corrections, trying to talk to the people and such is really important when it comes to our beliefs and our one-on-one actions with each other. All right, finally, we've all heard of King James I. I mentioned him just because he's a couple of things that are well known to us. He ascended the throne after Elizabeth. He had already served 36 years as King of Scotland when he came over to be King of England. He again was a strong Protestant, was big on urging free thinking among religious groups. He had a goal of trying to merge the Scottish and the Anglican churches under one confession of faith. But probably more than anything, he's known in 1611 as being the one that helped get the first official English translation of the Bible produced, the King James Version. And he's also well known because in December of 1620, he was responsible for getting the first colony over to the Americas at Plymouth Rock. So something to look at now, I wanted to just think, because I think it plays a big important, is the getting of the Bible translated where not practical, but the everyday people had access to a Bible. As we mentioned up there, it says practical reformation has never been possible without the average person having access to the Scripture. Because if you can imagine what a world would be like, I think we so easily take that for granted of having access to a Bible. Now, we've talked a little bit about that before. But think about it, if as questions came up, say you went to church and the priest said something and you were kind of questioning that. Think what it would be like if you had absolutely no access to a Bible. You couldn't go on the internet, you didn't have your phone, you had no written copies. how difficult that would be to ever do anything but just take everything they say for the truth. You had really no option if you had no way to. The early Bibles were typically written in Latin, or even in the other languages that the common people wouldn't be able to understand. So it's hard for us, I think, just to imagine, because we tend to think, well, these people believed all this stuff, and why didn't they just check it out? Well, the problem was they couldn't check it out for the most part. So if they were told something by the priests or the Pope came down with a decree, they really had little choice but just to believe it. And that's what that's really what helped the Reformation kick off. We'll look quickly at a couple of thoughts on just the Bible translations as they came out. It mentioned there were some early attempts to translate it into English before 1000 AD. But really the first one to make any headway there is Wycliffe. And we talked about him again, but Wycliffe didn't use the original Greek and the Hebrew when he was translating. He used the Latin Vulgate. So I think we said that he really did a translation of a translation. So while it was certainly better than nothing, it did have some problems with the translation. But the group, the Lollards, who are big followers of Wycliffe, used this. It also influenced this other Reformation that was going on in Bohemia. Then a lot of them, the one that you've probably heard about, Tyndale, he's quoted as saying he had a desire to see the Bible in the hand of every plowman. So basically, I want to get it so that the Bible's in the hands of every, lay person that's out there. He worked for about 10 years to he produced the English translation while in exile. He was exiled because of his beliefs in Cologne and Worms, Germany. Printed the first New Testament, or the first printed English New Testament was of Tyndale. He also started working on publishing of the Old Testament. It said up to 15,000 copies of the New Testament were issued or through his getting those printed. And there's some stories about him secretly importing into England and other countries because of the problem with, still at the time, there's a lot of punishment to getting the Bible in the hands. But he had ways, it says he did sometimes in bales of cotton, sacks of flour, and other means just to try to get those Bibles imported. The thing about Tyndale that was really a step in the right direction is he used the original languages. Again, he translated New Testament in 1525, the Pentateuch in 1530. He picked a few other books, the Book of Jonah and the Psalms. It had mentioned that once King James, the group got together to do the King James Version, that his turned out to be really close, about 90% to what the King James translation ended up being some years later. Again, the same king, less than 10 years later, there was a guy named Miles Coverdale. They got him to start working on revising Tyndale's work. And since the King James Version up this time, there's been about 12 or 13 different translations to come after the King James Version. But again, these people weren't doing this as wasn't accepted. If you look up here, Tyndale on October 6, 1536, he kind of got the double whammy. He was strangled and burned at the stake. And it mentions his last words were, "Open the eyes of the King of England." And it just shows a statue there that sits on the Thames River over in London. So again, we tend to think, well, it was just a nice time. He was sitting there translating the Bible, but he was doing this knowing that if he got caught or if the wrong people found out about it, it would cost him his life. And in his case, and a lot of other cases, people's lives, it did cost him his life. Again, this Miles Coverdale work began, which is taken mostly from Wycliffe's and Tyndale Bible. 1557, the Bible was finally divided into chapter and verse. Also a prologue to each book with summaries and notes written by some of these authors. It said by 1579 that the Bible had finally gotten readily available, that the average home was able to afford one. Remember, we talked about those early translations. Sometimes people would sit and wait for hours and pay a lot of money just to be able to read the Bible for an hour. So by the late 1500s, finally, the Bible had gotten where the people were able to afford them and get them into their home. It's mentioned in this bishop's Bible. I wasn't familiar with that one. Again, through the early 1600s through late 1700s, there were a lot of revisions of the King James Version. It came about 1881. Excuse me. Some of you may have heard about the Codex Alexandrinus and the Codex Sinaiticus, if I'm pronouncing those right, were discovered. So those are basically a finding on parchment of pretty much the entire Bible. And so it gave them a little bit more insight. Once that came out, it mentioned that this is back in the late 1800s, there were advance orders for almost 2 million copies when people heard that it was coming out. Over 3 million copies were sold in the first year, so that's amazing for late 1800s. 1901, a lot of you may even look at the American Standard. So this American Revision Committee brought out their version, the American Standard Version, early 1900s. Excuse me. And finally, we made our way up to Martin Luther. We've been talking about him and the impact that he has had on the Reformation. You know, I was talking to someone earlier, as we go through this, there's so many people, so many events that happened during this time that we could have touched on. And a lot of the class, I was mentioning, a lot of the class is just trying to figure out what's important, what's more important, what would be interesting, what's something that maybe will apply to us better, because there's just so many people that had a big impact on the Reformation movement and the Restoration that we're going to look later. But probably none had a bigger impact than Martin Luther. We still hear that, you know, the Lutheran Church of today gets their basis back from Martin Luther. But to give you just a little bit of background on him, I think it kind of helps us to understand where people are coming from. So he was born into an upper middle class family in Eisenberg, Germany. He was soon moved there. So his father was pretty well to do. He dealt with copper refining. He was also on the town council. And we'll see that Martin Luther, like a lot of these guys, were highly educated. You know, he attended a local Latin school that was run by some monks. He was recognized for his knowledge and sent to a nearby, excuse me, to attend another school, kind of like their high school that was run by a local monastic order. In 1501, he was accepted into a university, at the time considered one of the most distinguished universities in Germany, this University of Erfurt. And in 1502, got his first bachelor's degree and went on to start working on his master's degree. So I found this interesting. Those that were really considered, you know, kind of on the leading edge or the smarter students coming out of university were typically given the ability to pick one of these three. They could go into law, medicine, or theology. And his dad was, of course, big into business and law, so he really pushed him to choose law. There's an interesting story about Martin Luther. It says about 6 weeks later, he abandoned it and joined a monastery. And when asked about that, he said that the reasoning was that he'd been caught in a terrible lightning storm, really feared for his life. And he made this vow with God that if he survived, he would become a monk. Well, so he survived, and he kept his word. And 6 weeks later, after starting his law degree, he stopped and went over and became a monk. Of course, it's mentioned that his father was extremely angry over his decision. He kept studying. In 1509, he received Master in Bible. 1510, he began work on his doctorate in theology. So again, a man that's very highly educated. A turning point he mentioned as one of the kind of turning points in his life was that he was selected to go represent this group of Augustinian monks in Rome to the Pope. So it was really a high honor to be able to go do that. But he said it was here that he first observed, you know, I think it'd be kind of like us going, you know, he's expecting this kind of bastion of spirituality. He's going to get to go visit the Pope in Rome. And he said he was so shocked at times by the lack of spirituality among a lot of the people that he had contact in the papacy. he said it would later to go on to profoundly affect him. And if you remember, a lot of his ideas when he came back had to do with the way priests acted and so forth. And a lot of this kind of set off is doing this when he went on this trip to Rome. He came back, finished up his doctorate, and really started lecturing in Wittenberg, the University of Wittenberg. He was known there for his classes on Psalms, Romans, Galatians, and Hebrews. And we've touched a little bit on this earlier, so I won't take a whole lot of time. But again, in 1517, he nailed the first of his theses, the 97th thesis. Probably most people haven't heard of that one. Just real quick, if you weren't here, so a thesis is really just kind of a listing. And when it says the 97th thesis, so there were 97 thoughts or statements that he put in there. Those had most to do, the first one he did in 1517 had most to do with things everybody would agreed with, things to do with the priests and some of the things we've talked about earlier, different Catholic practices that he didn't really agree with. So he didn't get much out of that. Most, like I say, most everybody agreed with that one, so there wasn't a lot of back and forth on that. So about a month later on Halloween, which will be our Halloween in 1517, he nailed the 95 thesis. So if you're familiar with him, this is kind of the biggie that you'll have heard about. And again, we've talked about, but if you remember, what was the one thing that this one differed from the first one on? There was one subject that he started hitting on, and we talked earlier about that. You remember that deal with the Pope? And there was another cardinal, and they kind of had this backdoor agreement that they were going to raise all this money so that the Pope could rebuild some cathedrals. And what do you remember what's the word for that? It's kind of a long word. The word that really, he set off, the 95 Thesis had multiple writings about this. So it's that thought of those indulgences that we talked about. Being able to kind of buy the ability to, we talked about it, it really set off when you could start buying indulgences for your loved ones and so forth. But basically what a thesis is just it's your beliefs on a range of religious subjects. It was put up there, we talked about it was written in Latin, so the average person wouldn't have been able to read it. So it was just like, here are my thoughts for today. I'm going to put them up here. If you agree with them, you probably wouldn't hear anything. If you didn't agree, then people might come out and say, let's talk about that. So it was really something that on the face of it was just a small thing to do. People probably did these all the time. People would put their thoughts up there. They didn't have any way to publish them other than that. We don't have the internet, or they didn't have the ability to put their views. We see that a lot of Facebook and stuff. People always feel like they got to put their views out. There was a similar deal. If you had some views on something religious-wise, you could post them up on or nail them to the door. All right, so I pulled out a couple of these. I'm sorry if that's a little bit small. So these are a couple that give you an idea of kind of what these theses look like. So if you're thinking through that. So number 32, those who suppose that on account of their letters of indulgence they are sure of salvation will be eternally damned along with their teachers. So again, he's hitting on this practice of selling these indulgences as a way for salvation. Number 36, every Christian who truly repents has plenary or full forgiveness both of punishment and guilt bestowed upon him, even without these letters of indulgence. So that was a big one that Luther was starting to work through, because in a sense, you remember, if you had to go ask for forgiveness, then the priest, you had to do that in front of the priest. He would give you penance, and then it would kind of start this circle. He's basically coming out and saying, when you repent and you have full forgiveness, these letters of indulgence aren't making any difference. Look at 37. It says, every true Christian, whether living or dead, has a share in all the benefits of Christ and the church, for God has granted him these even without letters of indulgence. So again, as you're hearing these, think back. These are going to get back to the Pope pretty soon. What's the impact going to be? Remember, the Pope's got this deal. We're going to raise a lot of money through these indulgences. And here's someone, as we talk, the church in a sense, a lot of these people are out there. The church would kind of let a lot of those just go by if you said something against the church. Well, they may not like it. A lot of times they didn't. But this one is really going to start affecting their pocketbook, because people are going to start believing, yeah, I see that indulgences, and start following Luther in that area. And what happens? All the money streams go start drying up. Look at 81. The shameless preaching of pardons makes it hard even for learned men to defend the Pope's honor against slander, or to answer the indubitably shrewd questions of the laity. So again, this is dealing with the pardons that we talked about, the church, and he's just coming out and saying these really aren't right. Finally, in 82, for example, why does not the Pope empty purgatory for the sake of the holy love? For after all, he does release countless souls for the sake of sordid money contributed for the building of a cathedral. You know, this is really kind of humorous, but what he's saying here, you remember we talked about this, there's this belief of purgatory over here, and that's where you go. You got to spend time after you die for unrepentant sins, or for any of the things you hadn't paid back, more or less, that the Pope had told you. I'm not the Pope, but say your priest had given you a list of things to do, and you didn't get them all done. So you got to spend this time in purgatory. The indulgences, after all, would have started allowing you, for your relatives, to pay you to shorten that time out. But really, what he's kind of calling out the Pope here, saying, why don't you just let everybody out of purgatory? Instead of for money, why don't you just do it for the fact of love and let people out? So really hitting the Pope pretty hard on some of these theses that he wrote. All right, 15, a couple other things about him, and literally we could spend weeks on Martin Luther. I've just tried to pick out a few things to kind of give you an idea because of the influence that he has, and he's being so well known. After all this came out, typically it was kind of odd, but typically the Catholic Church wasn't going to give you this arena to come together for a debate on your views if you differed on your views for them. But due to his popularity, they sent this Professor Eck to debate him on some of these issues. He came out here, and this is really where he started getting himself in trouble. He denied the supreme authority of the popes and all the councils. And if you remember, we've looked at those. And so now he's really starting to hit home with the Pope in 1520. So the following year, there were a couple of these debates that went on. They asked him to recount what he was saying. He would never do that. So in 1520, the Pope issues a bull of excommunication for Luther, and he was given 60 days to respond to that. So a bull is just a writing, or they're posting a letter of communication that goes out to him and says, you got 60 days to recount what you're saying, or you're going to be excommunicated. And we talked about that, you know, what that would do when people today have the same issue when they leave or come join a church. A lot of times their family turns their back on them. Well, not only was their family probably going to turn their back on them, the church is going to turn their back on them, and also the impact of that would have just from the fact that, you know, not only the Pope controlling just the theological side, but they control much of the day-to-day side. So you may be, you know, told to leave the city you're living in and so forth if you got excommunicated. But the story goes, on the very last day, there was a fire out there, and he took that papal bull that he had got and infamously burned it, said he wasn't going to recount. So in 1521, this is such a funny word, diet of worms. So I looked it up just because I said, surely that's not diet. So that's diet is how they all pronounce that. At least that's what the internet told me. So diet, and anytime you see a W, it's a V. So this is like the diet of worms. He defended his writing again to one of these groups. But in the end, they excommunicated him, condemned as a heretic. And most people at this point, really Martin Luther had a string of events that kept him. Most people, when they've been excommunicated and condemned as a heretic, would end up dying pretty quick. Yeah, I'm sorry. Some of these get a little bit small. But anyway, on his journey back, as he realized that once they condemned him, he was probably going to be in some serious trouble. So he's heading back to Wittenberg, where he was at. And he was kidnapped by a group of soldiers, and it turned out they were friendly soldiers, but this Frederick, he was the founder of the university where he'd been at for a while. He had taken a liking to Luther. And he secretly took him to the Wartburg Castle near the town of Eisenberg, where he remained hidden for nearly a year. Talks about this was during his time. He did his German translation, which ended up having a big impact in Germany once he got that of the New Testament that he worked on. And there was a lot of speculation, really what most people thought, that he was dead and that the Catholics had somehow just got him, ended up killing him, and he was no more. But it was turned out he was hidden in this castle for a year. Did a lot of his most well-known writings during this time where he was in this castle. And finally, about 2 years through this process, the Reformation had taken such a strong hold within Germany that I guess he didn't fear as much for his life because there were so many people behind the Reformation. He didn't feel like maybe the Catholics were going to come in and kill him because of his support. So anyway, he started finally venturing out. In 1525, he married a nun. So there's a story that due to his teachings, a whole group of nuns had decided to turn their back on the Catholic Church. So he had secretly got some people together, and they'd kind of whisked these nuns out of their convent and got them away to safety. But one of those nuns by the name of Catherine von Bora, that he helped escape, he ended up marrying her, had 6 children. And I thought this was kind of touching, especially having a daughter. But he had 4 sons and 2 daughters. His first daughter, Elizabeth, died at the age of 6 months, and his second daughter, Magdalena, he talks about this in one of his deaths, that she actually died in his arms at the age of 13 after an extended illness. And I included a quote that he made, which I've thought about this. This would be tough to say if your daughter had died. But look at this quote. It says, "I love her a lot, but good God, if your will is to take her, I will give her to you with great pleasure." And so I think this had, if you see some of his writings, he talks about losing his 2 daughters and the impact they had upon his life. It was also during this time, he's starting to get a little bit older now, that he began to start losing popularity. There were some other reformers coming in, Munzer and Zwingli, Bucer. These guys tended to have a little bit more of a radical view on reform and were starting to get more popular. And really after 1525, which is about the time he got married, he really kind of stepped back and started taking more of a theologian, advisor, facilitating role, and really wasn't kind of the man out front leading the reform anymore. One thing I wanted to include here, because there's been a lot of speculation as to what caused this, but later in his life, he came out with really some controversial pronouncements. Some have said, well, maybe mentally there were some issues here, but we talked about the Anabaptists. So he came out and made a proclamation that the Anabaptists should be hanged as seditionists, mainly due to some of their beliefs on baptism and so forth. He came out and said the Pope was the Antichrist, and also his stance on Jews. So he said that the Jews should be expelled and their synagogues burned. So I'm pointing those out, I don't really know what the reasoning was behind those. But just to say, they were all kind of, he's human, and while he did a lot of good, he certainly had some views and such that when we look at those today wouldn't really align with what we would think would be from.
You have to judge these people by the past, because the Huguenots and the Catholics have done horrendous things they've done, and they didn't all through the generations.
Yeah, so John's comment was, we have to, it's important, I think, to judge these people based upon the time that they're living and what was going on. There were a lot of things that were going on. Finally, after several years of failing health, Luther died in February of 1546. Oh, let me get to that. There it is. Yeah, I thought this quote is kind of comical, but I think he was a lot more right than what he thought about when he wrote this. This was shortly before his death. He said, "When I die, I'm going to come back as a ghost and haunt the Pope and bishops. They will have far more trouble with the dead Luther than they ever did with the live one." And I think how true that is. That's been a legacy, or they've been fighting that group, the Lutheran group, ever since then. Couple last things, just a couple legacy he left. He's considered one of the most influential figures in Western civilization during the last millennium. He was the catalyst for the division of Western Christendom into several different religious groups. Protestant scholars viewed him as maybe as the most stunning exponent, okay, I'm not sure that's the right word, of the authentic Christian faith since the time of the apostles, while Catholics viewed him as the epitome of theological ignorance and personal immorality. So again, you're viewed by the side that takes your views. On one side, he's considered maybe one of the greatest reformers, while the Catholic Church doesn't have very good views for him. A couple of the basic tenets of his theology. The Word of God is the only source of religious authority. You remember the Catholic Church had all these other groups that would help. The Pope himself would make a lot of rules, but Luther came back and said, really, we need to be looking at the Word of God. Salvation can only be achieved through faith and reliance on God's grace, not through good deeds. As you remember, after his study through the Catholic Church in the times, he really came to feel like that was a good deeds-based religion there, and so he's trying to say, good deeds don't really play a role in it. Salvation is achieved through faith and reliance upon God's grace. And finally, his understanding of the church as a community of the faithful, a priesthood. His statement was a priesthood of all believers rather than the hierarchical structure imposed by man. So he was against the hierarchies that had grown up through the church. A couple things about the Lutheran Church itself. At the time of the writing, third largest Protestant movement after the Anglican and Pentecostal movements, has around 80 members worldwide, 80 million members worldwide. People have said that Luther probably would have been appalled if he would have known that a religious group at the time of his life, I don't believe the Lutherans had taken on the name, but it says he would have been appalled if they would have known that he was using his name. And I kind of take that back to remember when Paul, some say you're of Paul, some Apollos, and it really got him mad because we really should be known as Christ. And his name that he preferred was Christian and not Lutheran. There's a large number of Lutheran denominations worldwide. The two biggest in the U.S. are the Lutheran Church Missionary Synod. They go by the term of LCMS. This is the most conservative group. They hold the Bible as the inspired and inerrant Word of God. They allow you to only take communion with other Lutheran church bodies. That's called closed communion. They do not, at least at this time, allow LGBT groups to hold offices, whereas the second group down here, the ELCA, the Lutheran Church, Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, they'll say that the Bible, while it is certainly God's Word, it's not always accurate and trustworthy in all of its details and parts. They allow you to take communion and fellowship with all these other different groups that we've got listed here. And they also allow now members of the LGBT community to hold offices within their churches. Really, their local congregations are part of these called synods. We talked about those. Synods were just a smaller meetings. But they were really to help the congregations with helping certain areas. They would serve as regional support and guide the hiring of pastoral and other staff. Really, their historical doctrine or standard is this document that was published called the Book of Concord. It really has 10 foundational documents that if you're going to be of the Lutheran faith, you have to agree that those are correct. As we wrap up, a couple things. Baptism, they do it through sprinkling or pouring onto the head. They'll baptize both babies and adults. It's kind of hard on how they're wording, but their wording says it's necessary for salvation, but it's not essential. So I'm not sure where the difference there is. This quote is, "Still baptism dare not be despised or willfully neglected, since it is explicitly commanded by God and has His precious promises attached to it. It is not a mere ritual, symbol, or powerful means of grace by which God grants forgiveness of sin." So we would agree with some of that. I think we've pretty well covered it all. These are just, that's the last one. So real quick, the end times, Lutherans believe that Christ will return only once visibly and will catch us up, the Christians together. Heaven and hell, they do view it as literal places. The Lord's Supper, there's some differences on the way the Catholic Church, they got transubstantiation, that big word that just means they believe that the two are really his body. The Lutherans don't believe that, but they also don't believe they're just symbols either. There were some differences. They do reject the idea of purgatory, which we would agree with. And finally, they believe that salvation is available to all humans through the redeeming work of Christ. All right, well, thank you. I'm sorry to have gone over just a little bit. And next week, we'll finish up the Reformation and kick off the Restoration.